Hi, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Phil Moeller, and I write about aging and retirement for U.S. News and World Report. And today, we're enjoying a gorgeous day in Boston, and we're here to talk about the Conversation Project, which deals with important discussions that family members need to have in the later stages of life. And with me here today is Ellen Goodman, who's a co-founder of the Conversation Project, and also, as you probably know, just a marvelous syndicated columnist in the past with the Boston Globe. Also joining us are Harvey Freishtat, who's a director of the Conversation Project and who works actively with many Boston area medical institutions, and from what I hope is sunny New Hampshire, Ira Byock, who's a physician who specializes in palliative care, and he's director also of palliative medicine at the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. So the first question I have for Ellen is, I just want her to sort of explain to us why she started the Conversation Project and sort of how it's been developing so far in terms of what's transpired.
Well, the Conversation Project is a public engagement campaign to have everyone's end-of-life wishes expressed and respected. And we started this campaign because, in fact, people's wishes are not expressed or often respected. Too many of the people that we know and love are not dying in the way that they would choose, and we know that from all kinds of data. We know, for example, that 70% of people say they wish they would die at home, and 70% of people are dying in hospitals and institutions. And at home is not necessarily a place, it's a way of dying, surrounded by people that you love in comfort. Well, we believe that so many people we know have stories. In fact, everybody has a story. I'm sure that everybody who's listening to this has a story of a good death or a hard death. And we haven't really shared those stories. And the Conversation Project is about sharing those stories as a lever of change and about making these conversations much easier. So on our website, which is theconversationproject.org, we have a starter kit, and that has been hugely user-friendly. It's a very low bar of entry. It's not a lot of medical questions. We ask people what matters to you, not what's the matter with you. And we are trying to get people to have these conversations with the people they love at the kitchen table. And we want to change the cultural norm from not talking about the kind of care we want and the kind of care we don't want at the end of life to talking about it. And that is at the simplest level, what our goal is. And so far, we have had a huge and tremendous response. We feel people are really ready to have these conversations, but they need some help.
Our next question is for Harvey, in terms of talking to us a little bit about what kind of roles other institutions in society maybe need to play, and what can be done to sort of help them step up a little bit in terms of taking a more active role in helping people to have these kind of conversations.
Right. After we launched the Conversation Project with a website and the national media campaign last summer, we were, I guess, very favorably impressed with the response, a response that came not only from individuals around the country and indeed beyond, but also from various sectors. We were contacted, for example, by various companies, corporate America. And why corporate America? Because increasingly employees in many of our large companies and smaller companies around the country are working by day and caregiving by night, caregiving to their loved ones. And sometimes the caregiving extends beyond the night into the day. And so for many employees, it's very stressful. And for many companies, it's increasingly an issue of productivity and helping their employees deal with the stress. And so, indeed, we are talking with several companies around the country now as to ways that we, the Conversation Project, might be a resource to them, to their human resource professionals, and also to the company's employees and retirees actually directly as a resource to them in terms of dealing with end-of-life care communication issues, which can be stressful unless that resource is available to them. We've also been invited into a number of communities around the country, just over a 4 to 6 week period, California, Colorado, North Carolina, and others to follow, where communal leadership is looking for ways to prioritize better end-of-life care communication, and can the Conversation Project be helpful in that regard? And finally, we're working with a lot of faith-based communities. Wherever we go, we are looking for the clergy leadership of the community because of the terribly important role that they can play in helping their congregants and the spiritual community generally to focus on this area as a priority as well.
Great. Ellen, Ira?
Well, I think that we started too because we had stories, and I became involved in the project after my mother's death. And when I was faced, as many people are, with a cascading number of decisions that had to be made, for which I was wholly unprepared, and I assure you, unskilled. And that's when I realized that our project that we founded after that was not just for people who were dying or in advance of that, but for their survivors. Because we know when they have the conversation, these survivors are less depressed, less guilty, and much more comfortable. So the Conversation Project is really for everyone, and we hope that people will have these conversations early and not in the ICU, and I'm sure that Ira can speak to that.
Well, exactly. I think the Conversation Project is exactly what's needed culturally. You know, we spend in America our whole life not wanting to think about it. I mean, that's our cultural orientation toward anything having to do with illness, dying, caregiving, grief. I've tried to change the conversation that I have with patients and families to refocus on what's the best care possible for you or your loved one during this time of life. We want to use all medical treatments to save lives, to prolong lives, to make life as full and meaningful as possible. The problem is that we have yet to make even one person immortal. If all we do in America is not want to think about it and sort of put our hands up and not think about it, if as our colleague Lachlan Farrow often says, if it's always too soon before it's too late, you know, if that's the orientation, then we are disadvantaging not only ourselves in getting the best care, but we're setting up our loved ones to have unresolved issues, complicated grief. You know, grief is hard enough when it's just the sadness of losing someone you love. But in my experience, in my clinical practice, complicated grief happens when there's regrets, recriminations, you know, would-haves, could-haves, should-haves. Those are the sorts of unresolved issues that those of us who counsel people who are seriously ill and help walk with them through this illness know are preventable sources of suffering for their loved ones. So in this institution, at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, we encourage everyone to have the conversation, not because they're seriously ill, but because we think that having these conversations, completing those darn advanced directive forms, is part of giving one another the best care possible. I now say to patients, when I introduce the subject of having the conversation and having advanced directives, this is a way to take care of your family at a future time when they may be left to struggle about decisions about your treatment. We can't stop that because we're connected, we belong to one another. But we can give them clear authority to speak for you so that no ethics committee or court needs to get involved. And secondly, give them a sense of what you think you would want, just by discussing your values and preferences and priorities in general, so that you can trust them to make those decisions, but also maybe that they will feel supported by you in having to make, when they have to make those decisions. That's just good human caring.
We also know that social change happens when people tell stories. I mean, we learned that in the women's movement. I remember years ago, people were sitting with their own stories and they thought they were the only one. And I find that again true when we bring the Conversation Project to people, and we're bringing it to people where they live, where they work, and where they pray. And when we talk about this, everyone tells us their story. And we hope that everybody who sees this will also come on to our website and tell us their stories. I wanted to add that because in Boston we've had an incredible period after the marathon bombing, that was a moment when nobody who tied on their shoes that morning knew that they were going to be faced with critical decisions. And yet many people, unfortunately, were at all ages. And we also, on Monday, brought together a group of Boston religious leaders and clergy who've become part of our faith-based initiative, an interfaith group. And prior to that, these people had been leading our community in comfort work and in pastoral work. And we thought, will they actually have the energy to come to our meeting? And they all said, yes, this is something we have to do. So we know that this is important to communities, and we know it's important to individuals. And so we feel very energized in bringing this conversation and trying to create a real social change. We think we're at a tipping point, and we want everybody to have these conversations at the kitchen table.
Do either Harvey or Ira have anything to add? Because we're reaching sort of the end of our time here. Any closing thoughts?
I would add only that that Ellen correctly called attention to the stories, and when you tell the stories, it becomes very clear that illness and caregiving and grief are only partly medical. They are profoundly personal for the individual who is ill and their families. And so, in telling the stories, we are taking the first step to reclaim these important times of human life, not simply giving them over to medicine to sort of take care of us or to medicalize these experiences totally. We can use medical care, but we should retain and celebrate the personal aspects of these times of life in all their poignance and sadness, but also in the richness and meaning that they contribute to our lives.
That's terrific. Yeah.
And I think that's why the question that we're asking everyone is, have you had the conversation? And we're hoping that the answer across the country will become a resounding yes.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today, and I hope we can have more and look into this in other ways. In the meantime, it's theconversationproject.org. Go there, check it out. If you have questions, you can email people, and they will respond to you and help you tell your story. So thanks so much for letting us tell part of our story today, and we look forward to doing this again in the future. And thanks so much to today's participants.